Sword Art Online, Echoes of Aincrad is finally out, and just like clockwork, it's another disappointment. Players have been ripping the game apart for its repetitive gameplay, lifeless world, fake open-world design, lack of meaningful exploration, recycled enemies, and a ridiculous $70 price tag that many reviews say it doesn't even come close to justifying. Even diehard Sword Art Online fans, the very people this game was supposed to please, have been leaving negative reviews and telling others to wait for a deep sale or skip it altogether. But let's be honest here. What exactly were people expecting? Seriously, why is anyone acting surprised? This franchise has been pumping out garbage content for years. Every single time a new Sword Art Online game gets announced, fans convince themselves that this will finally be the one. This will be the game that lets them truly experience Aincrad. This will be the game that captures the feeling of the anime. This will be the masterpiece they've been waiting for. Then the game releases, reality sets in, and everyone realizes they've been sold the same disappointment with a fresh coat of paint. At some point, you have to stop pretending these failures are accidents. When the same problems keep showing up over and over again across multiple releases, it's no longer bad luck. It's a pattern. Sword Art Online has one of the greatest premises an anime has ever created, yet somehow its games keep delivering painfully dull experiences that fail to live up to even a fraction of that potential. The franchise has had countless chances to get it right, and it keeps tripping over the exact same mistakes. That's why Echoes of Aincrad's failure doesn't shock me in the slightest. In fact, I think this outcome was inevitable. The real mystery isn't why this game disappointed so many people. The real mystery is why anyone expected something different in the first place. After years of trash, missed opportunities, and broken promises, fans are somehow still convincing themselves that the next Sword Art Online game will finally break the curse. So in this video, we're going to talk about why Echoes of Aincrad isn't the exception. It's the rule. More importantly, we're going to talk about why I don't believe there will ever be a good Sword Art Online game, because the problems go far beyond one or two bad releases. They're built into the way this franchise keeps making games.
For starters, one of the biggest problems is that the concept itself sets expectations that are incredibly difficult for any developer to realistically meet. The Aincrad shown in the anime isn't just another RPG. It's an enormous virtual world consisting of 100 completely unique floors, each with its own environments, towns, dungeons, quests, monsters, secrets, and a powerful boss guarding the next level. That's an absolutely massive amount of content to create. Building a game on that scale would require an enormous budget, years of development, and an extraordinary amount of talent and resources. Think about what that actually means. 100 unique floors, 100 unique boss fights, hundreds of different enemy types, hundreds of quests, distinct biomes, music, NPCs, cities, and mechanics that make every floor feel fresh instead of like a copy and paste job. It's not enough to simply make 100 maps. Every floor has to feel memorable. Otherwise, players immediately start noticing the repetition. That's an unbelievably high bar. Now compare that expectation to reality. Most modern RPGs don't even attempt something on that scale because it's simply too expensive and too time-consuming. Even many of the biggest AAA studios with massive budgets spend 5 or 6 years building a single open world. Expecting a developer to faithfully recreate the entire Aincrad experience without cutting corners is asking for one of the most ambitious games ever made. And that's exactly where the disappointment begins. Fans picture the limitless world they watched in the anime. Then a game launches that inevitably has to scale those ideas back. Floors get cut. Exploration becomes more limited. Enemy variety shrinks. Systems are simplified. Content gets recycled. It's not necessarily because the developers don't understand what fans want. It's because recreating the full vision of Aincrad is an enormous undertaking that few studios could realistically pull off. That's why nearly every Sword Art Online game ends up feeling like a compromise. Instead of delivering the massive virtual world fans imagined, players get a much smaller experience that captures only fragments of the original concept. The ambition of the source material is so enormous that every adaptation risks feeling incomplete by comparison, and that gap between expectation and reality becomes harder to ignore with every new release. Another problem is that even the anime never fully explored Aincrad. People love talking about all 100 floors as if the series gave viewers a detailed look at every single one, but that's simply not what happened. In reality, the story skips through huge portions of Aincrad. Entire floors are passed over without ever being shown, and many of them receive little to no attention at all. Viewers are left to imagine what those unexplored areas might have looked like. That creates a huge challenge for any game developer. Once you move beyond the handful of locations that were actually featured in the anime and light novels, you're no longer adapting existing material. You're inventing it from scratch. That means designing dozens of entirely original floors, monsters, towns, quests, and bosses while still trying to make everything feel like it belongs in the world of Sword Art Online. That's an incredibly difficult balancing act, and it's one reason fans often end up disappointed. The more original content a developer has to create, the more likely it is that players will feel it doesn't capture the magic of the series. Ironically, many fans dream about exploring all 100 floors, but the franchise itself never fully showed what all 100 floors were supposed to look like. Developers are expected to fill in enormous gaps while somehow matching the expectations that fans have built up in their own imaginations. That's an almost impossible standard to meet because no matter what the developers create, it will never perfectly match the version of Aincrad that every fan has pictured in their head. And that's likely one of the biggest reasons why Echoes of Aincrad only includes 2 floors instead of attempting to recreate all 100. From a development standpoint, designing 2 highly detailed floors is vastly more achievable than building an entire floating castle made up of 100 unique environments. Every additional floor requires new landscapes, new towns, new enemies, new quests, new dungeons, new music, and a completely original boss fight. The workload grows exponentially. Even creating 2 memorable floors is a significant undertaking. Trying to deliver 100 at that same level of quality would require an enormous amount of time, money, and development resources. That's why the developers appear to have focused on a much smaller slice of Aincrad rather than attempting the impossible. The problem is that this creates a disconnect between the fantasy that Sword Art Online sells and the reality that players receive. Aincrad is famous because it's a 100-floor death game. The scale of that world is one of its defining characteristics. When a game only lets players experience a tiny fraction of it, many fans inevitably walk away feeling like they're getting an incomplete version of the adventure they were promised. And that's the dilemma every Sword Art Online game faces. If a developer tries to build all 100 floors, the project becomes overwhelmingly ambitious. If they only build a handful of floors, players are left wondering where the rest of Aincrad went. Either way, someone is going to be disappointed. And honestly, the core gameplay loop of Sword Art Online sounds a lot more exciting on paper than it probably would be in an actual game. Strip away the life or death stakes and the emotional story, and the formula is fairly straightforward. Clear the current floor, grind for better equipment and levels, defeat the floor boss, unlock the next floor, and repeat. Then do it again, and again, 100 times. That kind of progression can absolutely work for a while, but over the course of 100 floors it would become incredibly difficult to keep things feeling fresh. Developers would have to constantly introduce new mechanics, enemy behaviors, environments, quests, puzzles, and boss designs just to prevent the experience from becoming repetitive. If each floor starts feeling too similar to the last, players will quickly notice the repetition and lose interest. The anime makes this formula feel exciting because it skips over the repetitive parts. It jumps from major event to major event, focusing on the most important battles, character moments, and story developments while leaving out countless hours of routine grinding. That's one of the advantages of storytelling. A 20-minute episode can skip weeks or even months of gameplay that would be tedious for a player to experience firsthand. A real video game doesn't have that luxury. Players actually have to live through every quest, every battle, every level grind, and every boss fight. What works as a fast-paced narrative doesn't always translate into engaging gameplay. Stretch that formula across dozens upon dozens of floors, and there's a real risk that many players would eventually start asking the same question. Haven't I already done this before? I think one of the biggest misconceptions among fans is that they believe they want a game that's exactly like the Sword Art Online they saw in the anime. It sounds amazing in theory. A massive 100-floor castle, endless progression, powerful bosses, rare loot, and the freedom to explore an enormous virtual world. On paper, it's the ultimate fantasy RPG, but the reality would probably be much different. A game like that would take years to finish, demand an enormous time commitment from players, and inevitably include long stretches of grinding, backtracking, farming materials, and repeating the same gameplay loop over and over. The anime skips past most of those slower moments because they don't make for compelling television. A real game can't simply fast forward through them. Players have to experience every hour of that content themselves. There's also another problem. Every fan has a different version of the perfect Sword Art Online game in their head. Some want a hardcore survival MMO. Others want a single-player RPG. Some expect Souls-like combat. Others want MMO-style tab targeting. Some want romance systems, guild politics, player housing, crafting, full freedom of exploration, permadeath, PvP, or hundreds of side activities. No matter what a developer creates, it will almost certainly fall short of someone's expectations because everyone is imagining a different game. That's why I think many fans are chasing an idealized version of Sword Art Online that can never truly exist. The anime presents the highlights of an incredible virtual world while skipping the tedious parts and leaving much of Aincrad to the viewer's imagination. A real game doesn't have that advantage. It has to fill in every gap, make every system work, and keep players entertained for dozens or even hundreds of hours. That's an extraordinarily difficult challenge, and it's one reason why so many Sword Art Online games struggle to live up to the fantasy that inspired them. One of the biggest advantages the anime has is that it only shows the exciting parts. It jumps from major boss battles to emotional character moments to dramatic story twists without making the audience sit through the countless hours of routine gameplay that would actually be required in a real MMORPG. Entire weeks or even months pass between episodes, allowing the story to skip over the repetitive grinding, leveling, gathering materials, crafting equipment, traveling across maps, and completing ordinary quests. The audience gets the highlights instead of the day-to-day routine. A real game doesn't have that luxury. Players have to experience everything the anime skips. If your character needs to become stronger before fighting the next floor boss, you can't simply cut to a montage. You have to spend hours earning experience, farming equipment, collecting crafting materials, and completing side content. If a weapon requires rare resources, someone has to actually go out and gather them. If a boss is too difficult, players have to practice, improve their builds, or grind until they're strong enough to win. That's where the fantasy starts to collide with reality. The anime condenses hundreds of hours of gameplay into a few minutes of screen time because watching someone kill the same monsters for 5 hours straight wouldn't make for compelling television. But in a real game, that's exactly what players may end up doing. The repetitive parts can't simply be edited out because they are the gameplay. This is one of the reasons adapting Sword Art Online into a video game is so difficult. The series makes the adventure look non-stop and exciting because it only focuses on the most memorable moments. A real game has to fill in everything between those moments, and that's often where repetition begins to set in. What feels like an epic journey in a 20-minute episode can become dozens of hours of routine gameplay when the player is the one actually living through it. The idea of clearing all 100 floors of Aincrad sounds incredible when you first hear it. It feels like the ultimate RPG adventure. Every floor promises new monsters, new environments, stronger enemies, and another massive boss standing between you and the next stage of the journey. It's an exciting fantasy, and it's easy to understand why so many fans want to experience it. But once you stop looking at it as an anime and start looking at it as an actual video game, the reality becomes much less glamorous. Getting through 100 floors wouldn't just mean fighting 100 bosses. It would mean spending hundreds of hours grinding experience, farming better equipment, leveling weapon proficiencies, collecting crafting materials, completing side quests, upgrading gear, managing your inventory, and traveling across enormous maps before you could even challenge the next boss. Then you'd repeat that entire process again on the next floor, and then the next, and then dozens more after that. The first 10 or 20 floors might feel exciting because everything is new. You're constantly unlocking abilities, discovering fresh environments, and learning new mechanics. But eventually, the novelty begins to wear off. Even if every floor is visually unique, the core gameplay loop remains largely the same. Explore the area, complete quests, defeat enemies, gather loot, get stronger, beat the floor boss, move on, repeat. Over the course of 100 floors, that's an enormous amount of repetition that developers would somehow have to keep engaging. The anime avoids this problem because it skips most of the routine. It jumps from one important moment to the next, making the adventure feel non-stop and exciting. A real game can't do that. Players have to live through every hour of progression, not just the memorable highlights. What takes 30 seconds in an episode could represent dozens of hours of gameplay in reality. That's why I think many fans underestimate just how demanding a faithful Sword Art Online game would actually be. The fantasy of conquering 100 floors sounds amazing until you're 50 or 60 hours in and realize you're not even halfway there. By that point, many players would probably be wondering how much longer they have to go rather than feeling excited about the journey ahead. There's a reason most RPGs don't ask players to complete the equivalent of 100 major regions with unique bosses and progression systems. It's an enormous commitment for both the developers and the players. While some dedicated fans would undoubtedly stick with it until the very end, I think a large portion of the player base would lose interest long before reaching floor 100. The concept is thrilling as fiction, but translating that exact structure into a game that's consistently fun from beginning to end is a much harder challenge than many people realize. Another major problem is that Sword Art Online has a built-in ending. The entire premise of Aincrad is to clear all 100 floors and defeat the final boss. Once that's done, the game is over. The objective has been completed. There isn't another 100 floors waiting after that. That's a great setup for an anime, because every story needs a conclusion. It's a much bigger problem for an MMORPG that's supposed to keep players engaged for years. One of the defining characteristics of successful MMORPGs is that they never really end. Developers are constantly releasing expansions, adding new regions, introducing higher level caps, creating new dungeons, launching raids, and giving players fresh goals to pursue. The world keeps evolving so that people always have a reason to log back in. Sword Art Online doesn't naturally work that way. Its biggest selling point is the 100 floor challenge. Once players finally conquer Aincrad, what happens next? If the game simply ends, many players would stop playing because they've already accomplished the main objective. If the developers keep adding new floors beyond 100, then it's no longer the Aincrad from the series. The entire premise begins to lose its identity. This creates another impossible situation for the developers. If they stay faithful to the source material, the game eventually reaches a finish line where much of the player base has little reason to continue. If they ignore the source material and keep expanding the world forever like a traditional MMO, fans can argue that it no longer feels like the original Sword Art Online. There's also the issue of progression. Imagine spending years, slowly working your way toward floor 100, only to finally beat the game. In most MMORPGs, that would be the point where a new expansion arrives with another continent to explore, new systems to learn, and another long-term goal to chase. In Sword Art Online, you've already completed the defining challenge that the entire game was built around. That's one of the biggest differences between a story-driven premise and a live service MMO. Sword Art Online was designed around a clear beginning, middle, and end. MMORPGs are designed around keeping players engaged indefinitely. Those two ideas naturally clash with each other. The very thing that makes Aincrad such an iconic setting is also one of the biggest reasons it's so difficult to turn into a long-lasting MMORPG. Another issue that people rarely think about is the in-game economy. A player-driven economy sounds amazing in theory. It gives players the freedom to buy, sell, trade, craft, and build wealth however they choose. But in reality, maintaining a healthy MMO economy is one of the hardest things developers have to do. It doesn't take long before the richest players and the largest guilds start pulling ahead. They accumulate huge amounts of gold, buy up valuable resources, control profitable farming locations, and dominate the market. Once that happens, they can influence prices simply because they have more money than everyone else. Rare materials become more expensive, desirable equipment becomes harder for average players to afford, and newer players find themselves struggling to catch up. The problem only gets worse over time. Veteran players have months or even years to build their fortunes while new players are starting from scratch. That creates an ever-growing wealth gap between the top players and everyone else. Eventually, the richest players aren't just participating in the economy. They're effectively controlling large parts of it. Modern MMORPGs constantly battle problems like inflation, market manipulation, resource monopolies, and price swings. Developers have to introduce gold sinks, adjust drop rates, rebalance crafting systems, and monitor the economy just to keep things from spiraling out of control. Even then, many games still struggle to maintain a healthy marketplace. Sword Art Online would face those exact same problems. In fact, with an economy spanning 100 floors and potentially millions of players, those issues could become even more pronounced. The fantasy of freely trading with other adventurers would quickly collide with the reality of players trying to maximize profits, flip items for gold, and corner valuable markets. And that's the part the anime doesn't really show. It doesn't spend episodes following players as they compare auction prices, calculate profit margins, manage inventories, or debate whether now is the right time to sell crafting materials. Those activities are a normal part of many MMORPGs, but they aren't nearly as exciting as dramatic boss battles. For many players, the adventure would gradually become less about exploring Aincrad and more about managing spreadsheets, watching market prices, and trying to keep up with an economy controlled by veterans and powerful guilds. That's the reality of many player-driven MMORPGs. And there's no reason to think Sword Art Online would magically avoid the same problems just because it's based on a popular anime. Another reality that many fans overlook is that no game can keep every player entertained forever. Even the greatest MMORPGs ever made eventually lose players. People move on, their interests change, new games are released, and life gets in the way. That's simply the nature of the gaming industry. Now imagine how much of a commitment a true Sword Art Online game would demand. You're not talking about a 20-hour RPG or even a 100-hour open-world game. You're talking about a massive MMORPG with 100 floors to conquer, countless hours of grinding, endless progression, systems, and potentially hundreds or even thousands of hours of gameplay before reaching the end. While that sounds exciting at first, very few players realistically stick with a single game for that long. Eventually, another major RPG comes out. A new MMO launches. Your friends move on to another game. Maybe you get busy with work or school. Maybe you simply want to try something different after spending hundreds of hours in the same world. That's exactly what happens with virtually every online game, no matter how successful it is. The problem for Sword Art Online MMO is that it asks players for an extraordinary long-term commitment. If the average player quits after a few hundred hours, there's a good chance many of them won't even come close to reaching the later floors. They may spend dozens or hundreds of hours progressing, only to eventually move on before experiencing the full adventure they originally set out to complete. That's another reason why the fantasy works better as an anime than as a real game. In the series, the characters don't have the option of simply uninstalling and playing something else. They're trapped inside the world, so they're forced to keep progressing no matter how difficult or repetitive the journey becomes. Real players don't have that motivation. The moment they stop having fun, they can log off and install another game in minutes. That's why I think many people underestimate how difficult it would be to keep a Sword Art Online MMO alive over the long term. It's not enough to make a great first impression. The game has to convince millions of players to stay invested for years without burning out or moving on to the next big release. That's an incredibly high bar, and it's one that even some of the greatest MMORPGs ever made have struggled to clear. Another major problem is the format itself. Sword Art Online is built around the fantasy of a full-dive virtual reality MMORPG. That's the entire appeal of the series. The idea isn't just that you're playing a game. It's that you're physically inside the game world. You look around naturally, swing your sword with your own movements, interact with other players face-to-face, and feel completely immersed in a living virtual world. That level of immersion is what made Sword Art Online such a compelling concept in the first place. The real games, however, can't deliver that experience. They're traditional video games played with a controller, a mouse and keyboard, or in some cases, maybe they have optional VR support that still isn't anything close to full dive technology seen in the show. No matter how good the graphics or combat are, you're always sitting in front of a screen. That fundamental difference means the games are trying to recreate the feeling of Sword Art Online without the very technology that defines the franchise. That creates an expectation gap that's almost impossible to close. Fans aren't just comparing these games to other RPGs. They're comparing them to the fictional game they watched in the anime. Unfortunately, no developer can build a real version of a technology that doesn't exist. As a result, every Sword Art Online game starts at a disadvantage because it can never replicate the core experience that made the series so fascinating. In many ways, the franchise is trying to sell players the fantasy of living inside a virtual world while being limited by the realities of today's hardware. Until full-dive virtual reality becomes more than science fiction, every Sword Art Online game will inevitably feel like a compromise. It may capture pieces of the setting or the story, but it can never truly recreate the experience that fans originally fell in love with. And that's the biggest obstacle of all. The technology that makes Sword Art Online so appealing simply doesn't exist. Full-dive virtual reality, where consciousness is completely immersed in a digital world and you can experience it as naturally as real life, remains firmly in the realm of science fiction. While virtual reality continues to improve, it's still nowhere close to what the series depicts. That means fans are chasing an experience that current technology simply cannot deliver. No matter how talented the developers are or how much money is invested into a game, they're limited by the hardware that actually exists. You can improve the graphics, refine the combat, expand the world, and add more content, but you still can't recreate the defining feature of Sword Art Online, actually living inside the game. Because of that, every Sword Art Online game is missing the very thing that made the original concept so captivating. You're not waking up inside Aincrad. You're sitting on your couch or chair holding a controller or clicking a mouse. The sense of total immersion, the feeling that every battle matters, and the illusion of truly existing in that world simply aren't there. That's not necessarily the developer's fault, but it does mean the games can never fully deliver on the fantasy that attracted so many people to the franchise in the first place. Unless technology takes a dramatic leap far beyond anything we have today, that gap isn't going away anytime soon. As long as full-dive VR remains fictional, every Sword Art Online game will be an imitation of the anime's central premise rather than the real experience fans have imagined for years. Even if a studio genuinely wanted to build the ultimate Sword Art Online game that fans dream about, the economics alone make it an incredibly risky project. Think about what people are actually asking for. They don't just want another anime RPG. They want a fully realized virtual world with 100 unique floors, massive cities, countless dungeons, hundreds of enemy types, memorable boss fights, deep progression systems, player housing, guilds, crafting, PvP, social features, and enough content to keep people engaged for years. That's not just a big game. It's one of the most ambitious projects imaginable. A game of that scale would likely require hundreds of developers working together for many years. Artists would have to create an enormous variety of environments, monsters, armor sets, weapons, animations, and visual effects. Designers would need to build quests, dungeons, combat systems, crafting mechanics, economies, and progression systems. Programmers would have to ensure all of those systems function together without falling apart. Then there's the enormous task of testing and polishing everything to make sure players aren't constantly running into bugs, exploits, or broken mechanics. And the work wouldn't stop at launch. If it's a true MMORPG, the developers would have to support it for years. That means maintaining servers, fighting hackers and bots, balancing classes and weapons, releasing new content, fixing bugs, responding to player feedback, running seasonal events, and employing customer support teams. Building the game would be a monumental task. Keeping it alive would be an even bigger one. All of that costs an extraordinary amount of money. Development budgets could easily climb into the hundreds of millions of dollars before the game even reaches players. At that point, the project isn't just competing with other anime games. It has to compete with the biggest MMORPGs and AAA RPGs on the market. If it fails to attract and retain a massive audience, the publisher stands to lose an enormous investment. That's why very few companies are willing to gamble on something this ambitious. From a business perspective, it's far safer to build a smaller, lower-risk game that reuses familiar systems than to spend years and hundreds of millions of dollars chasing an almost impossible vision. The unfortunate reality is that the Sword Art Online game many fans imagine isn't just difficult to make. It may simply be too expensive and too risky for most publishers to ever seriously attempt. To put the scale of this into perspective, modern MMORPGs are already among the most expensive and resource-intensive games ever made. They often take years to develop, require massive teams of artists, programmers, designers, writers, animators, composers, and QA testers, and continue receiving support long after launch. Even without trying to recreate Sword Art Online, building a successful MMO is one of the hardest challenges in the entire gaming industry. Now, imagine trying to build the game that fans actually picture when they think of Sword Art Online. You're no longer talking about a conventional MMORPG. You're talking about an enormous virtual world with 100 distinct floors, each packed with unique environments, monsters, dungeons, towns, quests, NPCs, secrets, and floor bosses. On top of that, fans expect deep combat systems, lifelike AI, realistic player interactions, guilds, crafting, player housing, an in-game economy, social features, and enough content to make the world feel truly alive. The scope quickly becomes staggering. Every system has to work together. Every floor has to feel different. Every boss has to be memorable. Every town has to feel worth visiting. Every new feature adds another layer of complexity, another development team, and another round of testing and balancing. It's not enough for the game to be big. It has to maintain a consistently high level of quality across an enormous amount of content. If you also add the fictional full dive technology from the series into the equation, the challenge becomes even more unrealistic. Full dive VR, as depicted in Sword Art Online, doesn't exist today, and creating hardware capable of delivering the kind of seamless, fully immersive experience would be an entirely separate technological breakthrough. You're no longer talking about developing just a game. You're talking about developing revolutionary hardware and software together. That's why I think many fans underestimate what they're actually asking for. The perfect Sword Art Online experience isn't simply a larger RPG. It would be one of the most ambitious entertainment projects ever attempted. The amount of money, time, talent, and technological innovation required would be on a completely different level from almost any game ever made. It's easy to imagine the dream. Building it is another story entirely. A true Sword Art Online MMORPG couldn't simply launch and call it a day. Releasing the game would only be the beginning. Unlike a traditional single-player RPG that can ship, receive a few patches, and move on, an MMO has to be constantly maintained and expanded to keep players engaged. It becomes an ongoing service that demands years of continuous support. That means developers would have to constantly balance classes, weapons, skills, and the in-game economy to prevent one strategy from completely dominating the game. They would need to patch exploits, fix bugs, combat hackers and bots, maintain servers around the clock, and ensure the game remains stable as thousands or even millions of players log in every day. Even a few hours of server downtime can leave an entire community frustrated. Then there's the challenge of keeping players interested after launch. MMO players expect a steady stream of new content. They want seasonal events, limited time activities, fresh dungeons, additional quests, new equipment, quality of life improvements, and regular updates that give them a reason to keep coming back. If the content slows down, players begin leaving. Once an MMO starts losing its player base, it's incredibly difficult to reverse that trend. On top of all that, the game would need dedicated customer support teams to handle account issues, investigate reports of cheating or harassment, moderate the community, and respond to technical problems. Behind the scenes, hundreds of people would still be working on the game years after release just to keep everything running smoothly. That's an enormous long-term commitment, both financially and logistically. The publisher isn't just investing in making the game. They're investing in supporting it for years, potentially even decades. If the game fails to attract a massive and loyal audience, that investment becomes extremely difficult to justify. And that's one of the biggest reasons why the perfect Sword Art Online MMO is so unlikely to happen. It's not just about building an incredible game. It's about maintaining an incredible game for years without letting the quality slip. Very few companies are willing to take on that kind of risk, especially when the costs are so high and success is anything but guaranteed. And even if a company somehow managed to build a game on that unbelievable scale, there would still be one huge question left to answer. How would it ever make its money back? A project of that size wouldn't just cost an enormous amount to develop. It would also be incredibly expensive to operate year after year. Servers would have to run around the clock. Developers would need to keep creating new content. Customer support teams would have to assist players. Security teams would be fighting hackers and bots. And engineers would constantly be maintaining and improving the game. Those costs don't disappear after launch. If anything, they become an ongoing part of running the game. At that point, the publisher has to generate enough revenue to justify all of those expenses. That likely means charging a premium up front, introducing a monthly subscription, selling expansions, offering cosmetic microtransactions, or some combination of all of them. Without a steady stream of income, it would be extremely difficult for a project of that scale to remain financially sustainable over many years. Now imagine asking players to pay for all of that. Would people really be willing to spend hundreds of dollars on the game itself, then continue paying every month for years? Some dedicated MMO fans probably would, but convincing millions of players to make that commitment is a completely different challenge. Many players already complain about paying $70 for a new game. Asking them to pay significantly more, plus recurring fees, would likely drive a large portion of the audience away. That's the economic reality that often gets overlooked. Fans imagine the perfect Sword Art Online MMO, but they rarely think about what it would cost to build and maintain. The bigger the game becomes, the more expensive it is to create, the more expensive it is to support, and the more pressure there is to generate revenue. At some point, the fantasy collides with basic business economics. Even if a publisher wanted to pursue that vision, they'd have to believe enough people would pay for it over the long term to justify an enormous investment. That's a very risky bet, and it's one that few companies are likely to make. The server costs alone would be enormous, and that's something many people never think about when they imagine a real Sword Art Online MMO. A massive online game isn't just expensive to build. It's expensive every single day that it's online. Every player exploring the world, fighting monsters, trading items, joining parties, chatting with friends, and participating in guild activities has to be connected to servers that are running around the clock. Those servers don't pay for themselves. They have to be maintained, upgraded, secured, and monitored constantly. As the player base grows, the infrastructure has to grow with it. More players mean more servers, more bandwidth, more engineers, more database management, more security, and more redundancy to prevent outages. If the game launches successfully and millions of people log in at once, the operating costs become even higher. And that's only one part of the equation. An MMO also needs teams dedicated to keeping those servers running smoothly, responding to outages, fixing technical problems, combating hackers, and ensuring players don't lose progress. None of that generates exciting trailers or flashy gameplay. but it's essential if you want a stable online world. Compare that to a traditional single-player game. Once it's released, the publisher doesn't have to worry about supporting millions of simultaneous players every hour of every day. There's no massive server infrastructure to maintain, no persistent online world that has to stay running, and far fewer ongoing operating expenses. The game can receive patches and updates, but the financial burden is dramatically lower than running a full-scale MMORPG. From a business perspective, the choice is pretty obvious. A single-player Sword Art Online game is far cheaper to develop, far cheaper to maintain, and far less risky. Even if it doesn't become a massive hit, the publisher isn't locked into years of expensive server costs and live service support. That's one of the reasons I think we keep seeing single-player or small-scale Sword Art Online games instead of the giant MMO that fans dream about. It's not just a creative decision. It's a financial one. Building and maintaining a true Sword Art Online MMO would require an enormous long-term investment, while making a conventional RPG is significantly cheaper, safer, and much easier to justify from a business standpoint. Another reason there will never be a truly great Sword Art Online game is because the fictional game itself is full of terrible game design. A lot of fans act as if the developers just need to copy what was shown in the anime, but if they actually did that, the result would be an unbalanced, frustrating mess. The problem isn't just that developers keep failing to recreate Sword Art Online. The problem is that the game portrayed in the series isn't nearly as well designed as people remember it. The biggest example is the concept of unique skills. In the series, one player gets access to an incredibly powerful ability that nobody else can ever obtain. That's not good game design. That's terrible game design. Imagine spending hundreds of hours grinding, mastering the game, and then finding out another player is simply stronger because the game handed them an exclusive ability that you'll never have access to. Most players would uninstall on the spot. Can you imagine any modern MMORPG launching with that system? The backlash would be immediate. Players would call it unfair, pay to win without the payment, or outright broken. Forums would be flooded with complaints. Social media would explode. Developers would be forced to remove or completely redesign the mechanic because nobody wants to play a competitive online game where one player gets special treatment while everyone else is permanently locked out. That's the funny part. Fans constantly say they want the exact Sword Art Online experience. But if a developer actually copied the anime mechanic for mechanic, those same fans would be the first people demanding changes. They'd complain that the balance is awful, that the progression is unfair, and that the developers have no idea how to design an MMO. They don't actually want the game from the anime. They want an idealized version that fixes all of its terrible design decisions. And unique skills are only the beginning. The more you examine the systems in Sword Art Online, the more problems you find. So many mechanics only exist because they make the protagonist look cooler or create dramatic moments. They weren't designed with fairness, balance, or long-term gameplay in mind. They exist to serve the story, not to create a game that millions of people would genuinely enjoy playing for years. That's why I think the whole idea falls apart under scrutiny. People keep asking for a faithful Sword Art Online game, without realizing that a faithful adaptation would expose just how poorly thought out many of its mechanics actually are. If developers copied the anime exactly, players would hate it. If they changed the mechanics to make the game fun and balanced, fans would complain that it isn't faithful to the source material. It's a lose-lose situation from the very beginning. Another problem is the complete lack of magic. For a genre built around endless possibilities, Sword Art Online's combat is surprisingly limited. You're basically swinging swords, using weapon skills, and repeating the same style of combat over and over again. Compare that to most successful MMORPGs, where players can choose from mages, healers, summoners, necromancers, druids, warlocks, elemental casters, and dozens of other fantasy archetypes that completely change how the game is played. Without magic, a huge amount of gameplay variety disappears. There are no devastating fireballs, no lightning storms, no teleportation spells, no magical support abilities, and no elaborate spell combinations that make encounters more dynamic. Combat becomes far more grounded, which might sound appealing at first, but over the course of hundreds of hours it risks becoming repetitive. Imagine spending hundreds of hours clearing 100 floors while the vast majority of combat revolves around melee weapon skills. That would get old fast. One of the reasons fantasy MMORPGs stay engaging for so long is because players can constantly experiment with wildly different playstyles. In Sword Art Online, those options are much more limited, making the overall experience feel less varied than many traditional fantasy MMOs. Ironically, despite being set inside a virtual world where the developers could have created virtually anything they wanted, the game's combat systems are surprisingly restrictive. Instead of embracing the limitless creativity that fantasy games are known for, Sword Art Online narrows the experience down to a much smaller set of mechanics. For a series that's supposed to represent the future of gaming, its gameplay often feels far less imaginative than the fantasy MMORPGs people have been playing for years. Another issue is the quest design. In the series, it's mentioned that many of the quests are AI-generated. That might sound impressive at first, but when you really think about it, it raises a lot of red flags. Procedurally generated quests have existed in games for years, and one of the biggest criticisms is that they often become repetitive. Instead of carefully crafted stories with memorable characters and meaningful choices, you usually end up with the same objectives repeated over and over with different names attached to them. Kill 10 monsters. Collect 5 items. Escort an NPC. Deliver a package. Clear a dungeon. Then do it all again somewhere else. Now imagine stretching that formula across 100 floors. Even if the locations looked different, players would eventually start recognizing the patterns. The quests would begin to blur together, and what initially felt like a grand adventure could easily turn into an endless checklist of repetitive tasks. The anime doesn't spend much time showing players grinding through dozens of ordinary quests, because that wouldn't make for entertaining television. It focuses on the important story moments instead. But if the game really relied heavily on AI-generated quests, players wouldn't be skipping those parts. They'd be the ones spending hours completing them. That's one of the biggest differences between an exciting fictional world and an actual game. It's easy to make AI-generated quests sound limitless because, technically, the game can keep creating new objectives forever. But quantity doesn't automatically mean quality. Players don't remember games because they had thousands of randomly generated quests. They remember games because they had memorable quests with strong writing, interesting characters, meaningful choices, and unique gameplay moments. If the bulk of Sword Art Online's content really came from AI-generated quests, there's a good chance many of them would start feeling interchangeable after a while. Instead of remembering specific adventures years later, players might just remember doing the same handful of objectives over and over with slightly different dialogue. That's not the kind of content that keeps people invested for hundreds of hours. Then there's the PvP system, which sounds like an absolute nightmare when you think about how it would function as a real MMORPG. Outside of a handful of designated safe zones, players are free to attack each other almost anywhere. On paper, that might sound exciting because it creates constant danger, but in reality, it would be a breeding ground for frustration and griefing. One of the biggest problems is that there doesn't appear to be any meaningful level restrictions. That means a high-level player could simply walk into a low-level area and slaughter new players who have absolutely no chance of defending themselves. Imagine spending your first few hours learning the game, trying to complete beginner quests and level up, only to have a veteran player repeatedly kill you because they can. That's not exciting gameplay. It's an easy way to drive new players away. This is exactly why many modern MMORPGs have systems designed to prevent that kind of behavior. They use level scaling, PvP opt-in systems, protected starting zones, or harsh penalties for repeatedly attacking weaker players. Developers learned long ago that if you give experienced players unlimited freedom to bully beginners, many of them will do exactly that. The result isn't a healthy community. It's a toxic one. Sword Art Online doesn't really solve that problem because it's a story, not a balanced online game. The anime follows a handful of important characters and focuses on dramatic encounters. It doesn't spend much time showing what life would be like for the average player who just wants to quest in peace without constantly worrying about getting ambushed by someone hundreds of hours ahead of them. If this were a real game, you can almost guarantee what would happen. Large guilds would dominate entire regions. High-level players would camp popular quest locations. New players would get repeatedly killed before they even had a chance to learn the game. People would complain about griefers, spawn camping, and unfair PvP every single day. Forums would be filled with players demanding protected zones, level restrictions, or the ability to disable PvP entirely. Ironically, the more faithfully you recreate Sword Art Online's PvP rules, the less enjoyable the game would likely become for the average player. A system where powerful veterans can freely prey on weaker players isn't good game design. It's the kind of mechanic that sounds dramatic in an anime, but would quickly become one of the most complained about features in a real MMORPG. And that's really the biggest problem with trying to turn Sword Art Online into a real game. If a developer faithfully recreated everything from the series, the game would be filled with mechanics that many players would consider unfair, frustrating, or poorly balanced. But if the developers start changing those mechanics to make the game more enjoyable, fans immediately complain that it isn't a real Sword Art Online experience. It's a no-win situation. Think about everything that would have to change. Unique skills would probably have to be removed or made available to everyone. Unrestricted PvP would need limitations to stop high-level players from endlessly farming beginners. AI-generated quests would likely need to be replaced with more handcrafted content. Progression would have to be rebalanced. Boss fights would need adjustments. Systems that sound exciting in an anime would have to be redesigned to work in a real online game. The more you fix those problems, the less the game resembles the Sword Art Online that fans have been imagining for years. Eventually, you reach a point where you've created a much better MMORPG, but it's no longer a faithful recreation of the series. It's just another fantasy MMO that borrows some names, locations, and characters from Sword Art Online. On the other hand, if you refuse to make those changes and stay completely faithful to the source material, players will almost certainly complain about the balance, the progression, the repetitive systems, and the unfair mechanics. Suddenly, the same people asking for a one-to-one adaptation start demanding patches, nerfs, quality of life improvements, and complete redesigns of the very features they originally wanted. That's why I think developers are trapped before they even begin. They can't win. If they prioritize accuracy, many players will criticize the game for having outdated or frustrating mechanics. If they prioritize good game design, another group of players will argue that the game isn't faithful enough to Sword Art Online. Either way, someone walks away disappointed. I think that's one of the biggest reasons there will never be a definitive Sword Art Online game that satisfies everyone. The source material and modern MMO design are constantly pulling in opposite directions. The closer you move toward one, the further you move away from the other. There's no magical middle ground where every fan is happy. No matter which direction a developer chooses, they'll be criticized for not choosing the other one. Another huge problem is the way boss monsters work. In Sword Art Online, once a floor boss is defeated, it's gone for good. It doesn't respawn. The next floor unlocks, and the players move on. That makes sense from a storytelling perspective, because the goal is to clear Aincrad one floor at a time. As a long-term MMORPG system, though, it's full of problems. Think about what would happen on a real server. The players who no-life the game during the first few weeks would naturally be the strongest. They'd reach each floor before everyone else, organize raid groups, defeat the bosses, and unlock the next areas long before the average player ever had a chance to catch up. Now imagine you're someone who buys the game a month later, or even 6 months later. You log in excited to experience the journey, only to discover that every major floor boss has already been defeated by other players. Those iconic encounters that were supposed to be the highlights of the game are already over. You didn't get to participate. You didn't get to experience the excitement. You simply missed them because you weren't there on day one. That creates an obvious problem. The game's best content would effectively belong to the earliest players. Newcomers would always be playing catch-up, and many of the most memorable moments would already be history. Instead of progressing alongside everyone else, they'd just be running through areas that had already been cleared months or even years ago. Modern MMORPGs avoid this issue by making bosses respawn or allowing players to replay raids and dungeons whenever they want. That way, everyone gets a chance to experience the game's biggest encounters, regardless of when they start playing. It's one of the reasons those games remain accessible to new players years after launch. Sword Art Online's system doesn't really allow for that. If the bosses never come back, then the window to experience those battles closes forever. That might create dramatic tension in a fictional story, but it will be a terrible way to run a persistent online game. Latecomers would always feel like they missed the adventure, and the gap between veteran players and new players would only continue to grow. Of course, developers could simply make the bosses respawn to solve this problem. But then you've run into the same issue that keeps coming up throughout this discussion. The moment you start changing major mechanics to make the game actually work as an MMORPG, it stops being the Sword Art Online that fans keep asking for. Once again, developers are stuck in a situation where neither option fully satisfies the fantasy. Another reason I think people end up disappointed is because the series creates expectations that simply don't translate to a real online game. In the anime, Kirito is the main character. The entire story revolves around him. He gets to be the hero, accomplish incredible feats, unlock unique abilities, overcome impossible odds, and play a central role in nearly every major event. That's how storytelling works. The protagonist is meant to stand out from everyone else. A real MMORPG doesn't work that way. There is no single main character because every player is the main character of their own experience. If millions of people are playing the same game, the developers can't give everyone a one-of-a-kind legendary skill that nobody else has. They can't make everyone the strongest player on the server. They can't make everyone the hero who saves the world. Those are mutually exclusive fantasies. That's one of the biggest differences between watching an anime and playing an MMO. In the anime, Kirito is exceptional because the story was written that way. In a real online game, you're just one player among thousands or even millions of others. Someone will always have better gear. Someone will always have a higher level. Someone will always defeat the boss before you, discover the strongest build first, or dominate the PvP rankings. That's simply the nature of competitive online games. The same applies to many of the relationships in the series. The anime is built around Kirito as the central protagonist, so it's natural that many important characters develop close relationships with him. In a real MMO, the world doesn't revolve around one player. NPCs don't treat you as the chosen hero simply because you logged in, and your experience isn't scripted to make you feel like the most important person in the game. I think that's something many fans overlook. They don't just want to play a Sword Art Online game. They want to play as Kirito. They want to be the legendary player, with the rare abilities, the incredible reputation, and the story that revolves around them. But that's a fantasy designed for a single protagonist, not a world shared by millions of people. Even if someone built the perfect Sword Art Online MMO tomorrow, it still couldn't give every player the experience they watched in the anime. The very things that make Kirito special depend on him being unique. In a real online game, if everyone is the chosen one, then no one really is. That's a fundamental limitation of a genre, and it's another reason why the idealized Sword Art Online experience is so difficult to recreate. Even if full dive virtual reality became a reality tomorrow, and someone built a game almost identical to the one in Sword Art Online, many fans would still end up disappointed because their expectations have been shaped by a fictional story. A lot of people imagine themselves logging in and becoming the next Kirito, but that's not how real online games work. The reality is that you probably wouldn't be the strongest player. You wouldn't be the first person to clear every boss. You wouldn't discover every secret before everyone else. You wouldn't unlock a one-of-a-kind ability that nobody else could ever obtain simply because you're the main character. In a real MMORPG, every player starts on equal footing, and thousands or even millions of other people are competing alongside you. There will always be players who have more time to invest, learn the mechanics faster, optimize their builds better, or simply outperform everyone else. That's another thing the anime doesn't have to worry about. Kirito is the protagonist, so the story naturally gives him extraordinary moments. He receives special attention because the narrative revolves around him. A real MMO can't revolve around every individual player. If one person gets an exclusive, game-changing skill that nobody else can ever obtain, the rest of the community would immediately see it as unfair. Developers spend years trying to balance online games so that one player doesn't become overwhelmingly stronger than everyone else. The same goes for fame and recognition. In the anime, everyone knows who Kirito is because he's one of the heroes of the story. In a real MMO, you're much more likely to be just another adventurer exploring the world alongside thousands of other players. Most people won't know your name. You're not guaranteed to become a legendary figure, and the game isn't going to script events around making you feel like the chosen one. I think that's one of the biggest disconnects between the fantasy and the reality. People don't just want to explore Aincrad. Many of them subconsciously want to experience Kirito's journey. They want to be the overpowered player who stands out from the crowd, earns the rarest rewards, and becomes the center of the world's biggest events. But that experience only works because it's a scripted story with a single protagonist. In a real online game, everyone wants to be that person. Obviously, that can't happen. Most players would have a much more ordinary experience, progressing at their own pace, joining parties, clearing dungeons, grinding for better gear, and blending into a world filled with countless other players doing the exact same thing. It could still be a fantastic game, but it would never make every player feel like the hero of an anime. That's simply not how massively multiplayer games work. And I think that's where a lot of the fantasy starts to fall apart. Once players realize they're not the strongest person in the game, many of them would probably lose interest surprisingly quickly. It's easy to imagine yourself as the legendary hero when you're watching an anime. It's much harder to accept being just another player in a world filled with thousands of people who are just as determined to succeed as you are. In a real MMORPG, there will always be someone ahead of you. Someone will reach the level cap first. Someone will defeat the newest boss before you. Someone will discover the strongest builds, obtain the rarest equipment, and dominate the leaderboards. No matter how skilled you are, you're competing against an entire player base, many of whom have more free time, more experience, or simply play more efficiently. For a while, that competition can be motivating. But for players whose dream is to become the next Kirito, reality may set in quickly. Instead of being the legendary player everyone talks about, they're one name among thousands. Instead of unlocking exclusive abilities, they're using the same skills and equipment as everyone else. Instead of being at the center of every major event, they're standing in line with countless other players trying to complete the same quests and defeat the same bosses. At that point, the fantasy that sold them on the game begins to disappear. The experience stops feeling like Sword Art Online and starts feeling like a normal MMORPG, because that's exactly what it is. The realization that you're not the chosen hero, that the world doesn't revolve around you, and that your accomplishments are shared by thousands of other players can be disappointing for people who expected to relive the anime. That's why I think many players would eventually quit, because it could never deliver the fantasy they had built up in their minds. The expectation wasn't simply to play an MMO. It was to become the protagonist of Sword Art Online. No online game can realistically give every player that experience. And once that illusion wears off, some people would likely move on in search of the next fantasy. That's the reality of multiplayer games. Your reputation has to be earned through your actions, your skill, and how you interact with other players. The game isn't going to hand you the spotlight just because you're the one holding the controller. That's another fantasy that works in an anime, but simply doesn't translate to a real online world. Another expectation that doesn't really hold up is the idea that you could play completely solo and still become the strongest player in the game. That's exactly what Kirito does for much of the series, but in a real MMORPG, that would be extremely unlikely. The reality is that the biggest challenges in MMOs are usually designed around groups. The hardest bosses, Raids and in-game content often require multiple players working together, each filling different roles and coordinating their strategies. No matter how skilled one player is, there are limits to what a single person can accomplish when the game is built around teamwork. On top of that, guilds have a huge advantage. They can share information, pool resources, help each other level faster, craft equipment for one another, organize farming groups, and coordinate boss attempts. While one solo player is slowly grinding through content, an organized guild with dozens or even hundreds of members is progressing much more efficiently. They can divide responsibilities, discover strategies faster, and recover from setbacks much more easily than someone trying to do everything alone. There's also the simple issue of time. In a real MMO, thousands of players are competing at the same time. Even if you're incredibly skilled, someone else is probably putting in more hours, playing with a stronger group, or benefiting from a well-organized guild. Skill matters, but organization and teamwork matter just as much. That's why the idea of one lone player consistently staying ahead of massive guilds becomes much harder to believe in a real online environment. History has shown that in many MMORPGs, the first players to clear difficult raids or world-first content are almost always highly organized groups, not individuals trying to do everything themselves. The anime can make Kirito the exception because it's telling the story of a single protagonist. A real MMORPG doesn't revolve around one player. It revolves around an entire community. If a true Sword Art Online game ever existed, the players dominating the server probably wouldn't be lone wolves. They'd be the largest, most organized guilds working together to maximize every possible advantage. Ironically, if someone tried to copy Kirito's playstyle exactly by avoiding other players and refusing to join a guild, they'd probably make the game much harder for themselves. Instead of becoming the strongest player on the server, they'd likely find themselves falling behind coordinated groups that are progressing faster simply because they're working together. That's how real MMORPGs tend to function, and it's another area where the fantasy of Sword Art Online doesn't line up with reality. Another thing the anime never really has to deal with is competition. In the world of Sword Art Online, the game is revolutionary. It's the first full-dive virtual reality MMORPG ever created, so naturally everyone wants to play it. There aren't dozens of competing full-dive games fighting for players' attention because the technology is brand new. Real life would be completely different. If full-dive virtual reality ever became a reality, Sword Art Online almost certainly wouldn't be the only game available. Every major publisher would want a piece of that market. Companies would be racing to create their own virtual worlds with different settings, gameplay styles, and features. Instead of everyone being funneled into a single game, players would suddenly have countless alternatives. Some games would focus on fantasy. Others would be science fiction, survival, horror, historical settings, superheroes, pirates, or modern warfare. Some would appeal to casual players, while others would cater to hardcore MMO fans. Every developer would be competing for the same audience, constantly trying to convince players that their world is more exciting than everyone else's. That creates a huge problem for a game like Sword Art Online. It wouldn't just have to be good. It would have to be better than every other full-dive game on the market. Players aren't going to stay loyal to one game simply because it's called Sword Art Online. If another developer releases a larger world, more engaging combat, better quests, more interesting classes, or more frequent updates, many players will simply switch games. We've already seen this happen throughout gaming history. New MMOs launch with huge player numbers, only to lose a large portion of their audience when the next big release arrives. Players are constantly chasing the newest experience, especially in online games where fresh content is a major selling point. There is very little brand loyalty when something better comes along. Ironically, Sword Art Online's biggest advantage in the anime is that it has no real competition. It's the only game of its kind that allows the story to focus entirely on Aincrad without asking why players aren't choosing something else. In reality, a successful full-dive VR industry would almost certainly be flooded with competitors, all trying to build the next must-play virtual world. And if that's the case, Sword Art Online would have to earn its place every single day. It couldn't rely on being the only option. It would have to compete on gameplay, content, updates, technical performance, community support, and value, just like every other MMO. That's a much tougher challenge than the anime ever has to acknowledge. And it's another reason why the real-world version of Sword Art Online would probably never live up to the idealized fantasy people imagine. With so many competing full-dive VR games on the market, it's hard to imagine Sword Art Online remaining the top choice if it kept the same mechanics shown in the anime. Players would have countless alternatives, and that means every game would have to earn its audience rather than relying on its name alone. Think about it from a player's perspective. If one game has more varied combat, another has better quests, another has a richer world to explore, and another offers more balanced PvP, why would you stick with a game that has mechanics you don't enjoy? Players have always gravitated toward the games that provide the best overall experience. They're not going to ignore dozens of better options simply because one game is based on a popular anime. Competition also forces developers to improve. If another studio releases a game with more engaging progression, fairer balance, more rewarding endgame content, or better social features, players can simply leave and play that instead. Unlike the characters in the anime, real players aren't trapped inside one virtual world. The moment they stop having fun, they can uninstall the game and move on to something else. That's why I think many people overlook just how competitive a real full-dive VR market would be. Sword Art Online wouldn't exist in a vacuum. It would be competing against dozens of other studios, each trying to build a better virtual world. If those competitors offered stronger gameplay and a more enjoyable experience, there would be very little reason for players to stay loyal. In a market filled with better alternatives, players tend to vote with their wallets and their time, and history has shown they're more than willing to move on when something better comes along. Competition is one of the best things that can happen for consumers because it gives them more choices. When multiple companies are fighting for your time and money, they have to work harder to earn it. They need to build better games, offer more content, improve their gameplay, fix problems faster, and provide better value than their competitors. If they don't, players simply move on to something else. That's exactly why competition would be a huge problem for a game like Sword Art Online. It wouldn't exist in a world where it's the only full-dive VR experience. It would be forced to compete against dozens of other developers, many of whom would likely build better games with more polished mechanics, deeper gameplay systems, stronger stories, more varied combat, and better long-term support. Why would players settle for a game with questionable mechanics if another developer offered a more enjoyable experience? Why stick with a game that has repetitive progression, controversial design decisions, or limited gameplay variety when there are countless alternatives that improve on those ideas? Players have no reason to stay loyal when better options are only a click away. We've already seen this happen throughout the gaming industry. No franchise is immune to competition. If a developer stops innovating while someone else delivers a superior product, players leave. They don't keep playing a weaker game out of nostalgia or brand recognition forever. Eventually, quality wins. That's why I think Sword Art Online would struggle in a real competitive market. It wouldn't just be judged against previous Sword Art Online games. It would be judged against every other full-dive VR game available. And if those competing games offered more balanced systems, more engaging content, better progression, and more reasons to keep playing, many players would naturally gravitate toward them instead. Ironically, the anime's version of Sword Art Online benefits from having virtually no competition. Real life wouldn't be nearly so forgiving. A game has to earn its audience every day, and in a market overflowing with alternatives, players are far less willing to tolerate weak mechanics or mediocre design. If there are 10 better games sitting right next to it, most people aren't going to keep choosing the inferior one. And those are just some of the reasons why I don't think there will ever be a truly great Sword Art Online game. The more you analyze the concept, the more problems begin to appear. It's easy to fall in love with the fantasy the anime presents, but turning that fantasy into a real, balanced, commercially successful MMORPG is an entirely different challenge. At some point, fans have to accept reality. The version of Sword Art Online that exists in their imagination simply isn't the same thing as a game that millions of real people could actually play and enjoy. The anime gets to ignore balance issues, skip repetitive gameplay, bend the rules for dramatic moments, and revolve everything around a single protagonist. A real game doesn't have those luxuries. Every time developers try to make a faithful adaptation, they run into mechanics that would frustrate players. Every time they change those mechanics to make the game more enjoyable, fans complain that it isn't faithful enough. It's a cycle that has repeated itself for years, and I don't see that changing anytime soon. The truth is that many fans aren't chasing a realistic video game. They're chasing a fantasy that was designed to be entertaining to watch, not necessarily fun to play. Those are two completely different things. What works in a scripted anime doesn't automatically translate into good game design, and expecting it to do so only sets people up for disappointment. We'll never get the perfect one-to-one recreation that so many people have imagined for over a decade. Not because developers lack talent, but because the concept itself is built on ideas that don't translate well into a real MMORPG. Sometimes the best version of a world is the one that stays fictional. And I think Sword Art Online is one of those worlds. The more you try to recreate it exactly as it exists in the anime, the more obvious its flaws become. The fantasy is exciting because it's a story. Once you strip away that illusion and look at it like an actual game, the cracks start to show. That's why I believe the perfect Sword Art Online game isn't just unlikely. It's probably impossible. At some point, Sword Art Online fans need to stop fooling themselves. Every time a new game gets announced, the hype starts all over again. People convince themselves that this is finally going to be the one that captures the magic of the anime. Then the game launches, reality hits, and everyone acts shocked when it doesn't live up to the impossible expectations they created. How many times does this cycle have to repeat before people realize they're chasing something that probably doesn't exist? The perfect Sword Art Online game has been right around the corner for years. Yet every release ends the same way. Excitement turns into disappointment, and then everyone immediately starts waiting for the next game as if history is suddenly going to change. In my opinion, that's a waste of time. Instead of endlessly hoping for a miracle, fans should move on and start playing games that are already excellent. There are countless RPGs and MMORPGs that offer better combat, better worlds, better progression, more content, and far better value. Those games exist today. You don't have to keep waiting for a franchise that has repeatedly failed to deliver the experience people keep imagining. I think a lot of fans have become attached to an idea rather than reality. They're not waiting for a good game. They're waiting for a fantasy that's been built up in their heads for over a decade. The problem is that no developer can compete with an idealized version of a game that only exists in people's imagination. At some point, you have to recognize when you're chasing a lost cause. Instead of spending years hoping the next Sword Art Online game will finally be the one, spend that time playing games that have already proven themselves. You'll probably have a much better experience than waiting for a dream that never seems to arrive. To me, the games are the definition of wasted potential. They take one of the most recognizable concepts in anime and repeatedly fail to turn it into something truly special. Every new release feels like another missed opportunity to finally deliver the experience that fans have been asking for. Instead, they keep falling short, leaving people wondering what could have been. But honestly, I think that reflects the franchise itself. Sword Art Online started with an incredible premise. The idea of being trapped inside a virtual MMORPG where death in the game means death in real life immediately grabs your attention. It's the kind of concept that practically writes itself. Yet, in my opinion, the series never fully capitalizes on how interesting that setup could have been. Instead of diving deeper into the game world, its mechanics, the psychology of the players, or the long-term consequences of surviving inside Aincrad, the story often shifts its focus elsewhere. Before long, the original premise that made the series so compelling takes a backseat. For me, that's where the biggest sense of wasted potential comes from. The games end up repeating that same pattern. They inherit an amazing idea, but never seem able to translate it into an experience that lives up to the promise of the concept. Every announcement creates excitement because people remember how fascinating the premise is. Every release brings expectations that this time the franchise will finally deliver. And every disappointment reminds people just how much unrealized potential there still is. That's why I see the games and the series in a similar way. They're built on a fantastic concept that immediately captures your imagination. But in my opinion, neither has ever fully lived up to what that concept could have been. Sometimes the most frustrating thing isn't that something is terrible. It's knowing how great it could have been and watching it never quite get there. Another reason I'm skeptical that things will suddenly change is because the franchise has already had plenty of opportunities to improve. This isn't a brand new series that's still trying to find its footing. Sword Art Online has been around for years. There have been multiple anime seasons, movies, games, and countless chances to learn from past criticism. Yet many of the same complaints continue to come up over and over again. Every new release is met with the same optimism from fans who believe this time will finally be different. Then the game comes out, the honeymoon period ends, and familiar criticisms start appearing again. After watching that cycle repeat so many times, it's hard for me to believe that the next release will suddenly solve all the problems. At some point, you have to look at the track record instead of the promises. If a franchise has had years to listen to feedback, refine its ideas, and raise the quality of its games, but people are still having many of the same conversations, then I don't think it's unreasonable to be skeptical that the next attempt will magically change everything. That's why I don't buy into the just wait for the next one argument anymore. I've heard it too many times. Every new game is supposed to be the one that finally gets it right. Every new announcement is supposed to restore everyone's faith. But eventually, hope has to give way to reality. A long history of disappointing releases doesn't suddenly disappear because another trailer gets released. Could the franchise eventually produce a great game? Based on its history, no. In my opinion, if years of opportunities, multiple releases, and repeated feedback haven't fundamentally changed the pattern, there's little reason to expect the next game to be dramatically different just because it's the next one. If you're looking for something better to watch, I'd recommend checking out The Northman from director Robert Eggers. It's a brutal, visually stunning Viking revenge epic that doesn't pull its punches. The cinematography is incredible, the action is intense, and the atmosphere is unlike almost anything else in modern filmmaking. Every scene feels meticulously crafted, from the haunting landscapes to the authentic Norse culture and mythology woven throughout the story. What really sets The Northman apart is how committed it is to its vision. Instead of relying on flashy spectacle alone, it builds a dark, immersive world filled with memorable characters, powerful performances, and a story that keeps pushing forward toward its inevitable conclusion. If you're a fan of mythology, medieval settings, brutal sword fights, or historical fantasy, there's a lot to appreciate. If you're deciding where to spend your time, I'd personally rather watch a film like The Northman than waste hours on something I don't find enjoyable. It's a movie that knows exactly what it wants to be and delivers a memorable experience from beginning to end. In my opinion, The Northman is a far better experience than Sword Art Online in just about every way that matters. It tells a focused, compelling story without relying on endless hype or asking the audience to imagine what it could have been. The characters feel grounded, the world is immersive, the action has real weight behind it, and the film stays committed to its vision from beginning to end. What I appreciate most is that The Northman delivers on its premise. It doesn't spend years building expectations that it never fulfills. It knows exactly what story it wants to tell, and it tells that story with confidence. By the time the credits roll, it feels complete instead of leaving you wondering what could have been. Sword Art Online, on the other hand, has always felt like a concept that promises more than it delivers. The premise is undeniably ambitious, but for me, the execution has never lived up to that promise. After all these years, I still come away thinking about the potential that was left on the table rather than the experience itself. If I had to choose between spending a couple of hours watching The Northman or diving back into Sword Art Online, it's not even a difficult decision. I'd pick The Northman every single time. To me, it's simply a more memorable, more satisfying, and more rewarding experience. The narrator at the beginning asks Odin to hear him. He mentions that there's a prince destined for Valhalla. In Norse mythology, Odin, often referred to as the All-Father, is the chief deity and ruler of Asgard, the realm of the gods. Known for his wisdom, Odin gained insights by sacrificing one of his eyes at Mimir's well. He is also associated with war, leading fallen warriors to Valhalla, where they prepare for Ragnarok, the apocalyptic battle. Odin is a master of magic and sorcery, particularly seed, and is credited with discovering the runes, symbols of power and knowledge. He is depicted with symbolic companions, such as his ravens Hugin and Munin, and his eight-legged horse Sleipnir. As a father to gods like Thor and Balder, and husband to Frigg, Odin plays a pivotal role in Norse cosmology, embodying traits of wisdom, battle prowess, and mystical insight that define his stature as a central figure in Norse mythology. Two ravens are shown. These ravens are named Hugin, Old Norse, thought, and Munin, Old Norse, memory or mind. They are often depicted as Odin's companions who fly across the world and bring him information. The raven's role is to travel the world each day and return to Odin with information about what they have seen and heard. They symbolize Odin's wisdom and his constant pursuit of knowledge. Their presence underscores Odin's connection to the realms of both thought and memory, reflecting his deep understanding of the world and the cosmos. The story takes place in AD 895. There are no specific Norse myths that are set in AD 895, because Norse mythology itself is a collection of myths and stories that were orally transmitted and later recorded during the Viking Age and thereafter. The Norse myths are not tied to specific historical dates in the way that recorded history might be. Instead, they are set in a mythical past that reflects the worldview, beliefs, and cultural values of the Norse people. The Viking Age, which is generally considered to have begun around the late 8th century AD and lasted until the mid-11th century AD, encompasses the time during which many of the Norse sagas and mythological tales were composed and circulated. However, these stories often describe events and figures from an earlier, mythological era rather than specific historical dates like AD 895. So, while there are no myths explicitly set in AD 895, the themes and characters of Norse mythology are reflective of the broader cultural and historical context of the Viking Age. The main character is named Amleth. Amleth, also known as Amlethis or Amlothi, is not directly from Norse mythology, but rather from a legend that originated in medieval Danish chronicles and literature. The story of Amleth is best known from Saxo Grammaticus Gesta Danorum, the history of the Danes, written in the early 13th century. In Saxo's tale, Amleth is a prince of Denmark who seeks revenge against his uncle Fengo, equivalent to Shakespeare's Claudius in Hamlet, for murdering his father and marrying his mother. The story of Amleth shares similarities with the later Shakespearean play Hamlet, which is one of the most famous adaptations of this legend. While the character of Amleth is not part of traditional Norse mythology, the story has become an important part of Scandinavian literary and cultural heritage, influencing later adaptations and interpretations in various forms of literature, theater, and film. Amleth's mother is named Gudrun. Gudrun, also spelled Gurn, is a figure from Norse mythology. She appears in several Old Norse sagas, including the Poetic Edda and the Volsung Saga. Gudrun is primarily known for her tragic story involving betrayal, revenge, and sorrow, making her one of the most prominent female characters in Norse mythology. Amleth's father is Orvindil Warraven. The name Orvindil appears in Norse mythology, but not as Warraven. Orvindil, sometimes spelled Orvindil or Orvindil, is mentioned in various Old Norse texts and poems, including the prose Edda and Skaldskaparmal, where he is depicted as a figure associated with the stars or possibly the dawn. In one mythological account, Orvindil is described as a friend or companion of Thor, the Norse god of thunder. According to legend, Thor carries Orvindil across the sky in a basket, but one of Orvindil's toes freezes and breaks off, becoming a star, possibly the planet Venus. This mythic tale reflects Norse cosmological beliefs and the poetic imagery associated with celestial bodies. As for War Raven, this specific name does not appear in Norse mythology or known texts related to Norse myths and legends. Orvindil gives Amleth a necklace. In Norse mythology, Orvindil is not specifically known for giving anyone a necklace. Necklaces and jewelry do play roles in Norse mythology, such as Freyja's famous necklace Brisingamen or Odin's ring Draupnir. But these items are associated with different myths and characters within the Norse pantheon. The jester is named Hymir. Hymir is not a prominent figure in Norse mythology. The name Hymir does not appear in the major Norse sagas, poems, or other primary sources of Norse mythology. Orvindil's brother is named Fjalnir. Fjalnir, sometimes spelled Fjalnir, is a figure from Norse mythology. He is primarily known from the poem Grimnismal in the Poetic Edda, a collection of Old Norse poems compiled in the 13th century. In Grimnismal, Fjalnir is mentioned as the son of Freyr, the Norse god associated with fertility, prosperity, and kingship. Fjalnir directly mentions Freyr in the movie, so that's pretty fitting. The poem describes Fjalnir inheriting his father's domain and rule after Freyr's death. Fjalnir's lineage and role as a successor to Freyr emphasize his importance as a mythological figure associated with kingship and possibly with aspects of fertility and prosperity as well. While Fjalnir's appearances in Norse mythology are limited, his mention in Grimnismal underscores his significance within the Norse pantheon, particularly in relation to the continuity of rulership and the divine lineage of the gods. Fjalnir has a son named Thorir. Thorir is a name that appears in various medieval Scandinavian sources, including sagas and historical texts, but it is not associated with a prominent figure in traditional Norse mythology like Thor, the god of thunder. Gudrun mentions that Orvindil's grandfather had to kill his uncle for the throne. There is no specific mythological account in Norse mythology that details Orvindil's grandfather killing his uncle for the throne. Orvindil himself is a minor figure in Norse mythology, primarily known for the story involving his frozen toe becoming a star. His familial background or genealogy is not extensively documented in surviving Norse texts, and there are no widely recognized myths or sagas that describe such a scenario involving Orvindil's grandfather and uncle. Amleth and Orvindil participate in a ceremony overseen by Hymir. There are no specific ceremonies like this in Norse mythology. It's mentioned that Odin lost his eye to learn the secret magic of women. According to Norse mythology, Odin sacrificed one of his eyes in exchange for wisdom and knowledge. The story goes that Odin desired to drink from Mimir's well, which was said to contain water with profound wisdom and foresight. Mimir, the guardian of the well, required a great sacrifice in return for this privilege. To prove his dedication and desire for wisdom, Odin willingly gouged out one of his eyes and dropped it into Mimir's well. In some versions of the myth, Odin is depicted as sacrificing his eye to gain a drink from the well, while in others, he gives up his eye to demonstrate his commitment to seeking knowledge. This act symbolizes Odin's readiness to endure suffering and sacrifice for the sake of acquiring wisdom and insight, making him a figure revered for his wisdom and supernatural abilities in Norse mythology. Hymir says that the Norns spin and weave at their well of fate. In Norse mythology, the Norns are female beings who control the destinies and fates of both gods and humans. They are akin to goddesses of fate and are responsible for weaving the threads of destiny that determine the course of all beings' lives. The line, "the Norns spin and weave at their well of fate," refers to their role in shaping destiny. The Norns are often depicted as sitting by a well or a spring known as the Well of Fate, Urebrunner. Here, they spin threads representing the lives of individuals, weave them into the fabric of fate, and then cut the threads when a person's life comes to its end. Their actions at the Well of Fate symbolize the continuous and intricate process of determining the events and outcomes that occur in the world, reflecting the Norse belief in predestination and the inexorable flow of fate. The Norn's weaving is a metaphorical representation of how every individual's life and actions are interconnected with the broader web of fate shaped by their past, present choices, and the overarching designs of the cosmos in Norse mythology. Hymir takes Amleth's tear. He promises to give it back when he needs it the most. Tears are not a prominent or central theme in Norse mythology compared to other mythological traditions. However, like in many mythologies, emotions and human experiences are reflected in Norse myths through the actions and reactions of gods, giants, and other beings. Amleth sees a vision of the Tree of Kings. The Tree of Kings is not a specific concept or entity that appears in traditional Norse mythology. The closest concept that might relate to a Tree of Kings could be Yggdrasil, the world tree, which is central to Norse cosmology. Yggdrasil is an immense ash tree that connects the 9 worlds of Norse mythology, including Asgard, home of the gods, Midgard, the human world, and Hel, the realm of the dead. However, Yggdrasil is not exclusively associated with kings, but rather serves as a cosmic axis that supports and connects the different realms and beings of Norse mythology. Orvindil is killed by Fjolnir. In Norse mythology, there are no detailed accounts of Orvindil's death beyond the story involving his frostbitten toe. Amleth escapes by boat. He swears to get revenge and save his mother. In a medieval Danish legend and subsequent adaptation by William Shakespeare in his play Hamlet, the character of Amleth, or Hamlet in Shakespeare's version, is driven by a desire for revenge. In a legend is recorded by Saxo Grammaticus in his work Gesta Danorum, The History of the Danes. Amleth's father is murdered by his uncle Fengo, Claudius in Shakespeare's play, who then marries Amleth's mother. Amleth feigns madness to disguise his intentions and plots to avenge his father's death by killing his uncle. His quest for vengeance forms the central plot of the legend, highlighting themes of justice, betrayal, and moral conflict. Shakespeare's adaptation of the legend in Hamlet similarly portrays Prince Hamlet's anguish and determination to avenge his father's murder by Claudius, his uncle and new stepfather. Hamlet's journey is marked by internal struggles, philosophical introspection, and eventual action, making revenge a central motif in both the legend and the play. Several years later, an adult Amleth is now a berserker in the land of Rus. There are no references or accounts in Norse mythology or in the traditional Norse sagas that mention Amleth, Hamlet, traveling to the land of Rus. Amleth encounters a seeress in the temple of Svedivit. There are no accounts or references in the original legend of Amleth, as recorded by Saxo Grammaticus in Gesta Danorum or The History of the Danes, where he encounters a seeress in the temple of Svedivit. The temple of Svedivit was associated with the Slavic deity Svedivit and was located in the medieval Slavic stronghold of Arkona, which is in modern-day Germany. The story of Amleth primarily revolves around his quest for revenge against his uncle, who murdered his father and married his mother. The narrative focuses on Amleth's cunning, feigned madness, and eventual actions to achieve his goal of avenging his father's death. The tale, as recorded by Saxo Grammaticus, does not incorporate elements from Slavic mythology or locations such as the Temple of Svedivit. Amleth learns that Fjolnir is now living in Iceland as a sheep farmer after Harold of Norway took his kingdom. The specific events involving Amleth learning about Fjolnir living in Iceland as a sheep farmer after losing his kingdom to Harold of Norway are not part of traditional Norse mythology. Harold of Norway, also known as Harald Fairhair, Old Norse, Haraldur Harfagri, is a historical figure who ruled Norway in the late 9th and early 10th centuries. He is credited with being the first king to unite Norway into a single kingdom. According to historical accounts and sagas, such as the Heimskringla, compiled by Snorri Sturluson in the 13th century, Harald Fairhair was a powerful chieftain who gradually unified various petty kingdoms and regions under his rule. His reign marked a significant consolidation of power in Norway, and he is considered one of the founding figures of the Norwegian monarchy. Harald Fairhair's name reflects his legendary reputation for his long, flowing hair, and he is often depicted in Norse sagas and later literature as a skilled warrior and ambitious ruler. His life and achievements have been the subject of historical study, and while some details may be embellished in sagas, there is consensus among historians that Harald Fairhair played a crucial role in shaping early medieval Norway. Amleth secretly boards a ship bound for Iceland, where slaves are being transported. On board, he meets Olga, a Slavic woman who says she is a sorceress. The events involving Amleth secretly boarding a ship bound for Iceland and meeting Olga, a Slavic woman who claims to be a sorceress, are not part of Norse mythology or the original legend of Amleth as recorded by Saxo Grammaticus in Gesta Danorum, the history of the Danes. Olga is not a figure from Norse mythology. The name Olga is not found in the traditional Norse sagas, poems, or other primary sources of Norse mythology. Norse mythology primarily revolves around gods, goddesses, giants, and legendary heroes within the Norse pantheon, and Olga does not appear as a character in these traditional mythological texts. Amleth says that his name is Bjornulfr. Bjornulfr, or Bjornulfr, is not a figure from traditional Norse mythology as recorded in the Eddas and sagas. The name Bjornulfr is a combination of two Old Norse elements, Bjorn, meaning bear, and Ulfr, meaning wolf. It is a name that could have been used by individuals in medieval Scandinavia, but does not correspond to a specific mythological character or deity. Amleth meets a he-witch. He-witches, or male witches, are not a part of traditional Norse mythology. Norse mythology primarily focuses on gods, goddesses, giants, and other supernatural beings, along with heroic figures and mythical creatures.